Hello and welcome back to World War II TV, folks, and I hope you enjoyed your weekend and are looking forward to just 4 shows this week about the North Africa campaign, which I can't believe it's taken a year and a quarter for me actually to tackle the North African campaign in its own kind of week. We've tackled various subjects that have come up here and there, but we are diving properly in to talk about a campaign that was pivotal to the outcome of the war and perhaps not as well talked about as some other campaigns. So that's what we're doing. Desert Air Force, 1940-1942. My guest today, I couldn't really have got anybody better. He RAF veteran, 20 years flying various types of aircraft, tornadoes and what have you. And he has written several books, including one about the Desert Air Force. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my guest, Ken Delve. And good evening, Ken. How are you doing?
Good evening. I'm doing fine. Thank you very much.
So we always start off with a bit of a how did you get into this? But flying aircraft with the RAF for 20 years is a fairly kind of obvious inroad to studying the Air Force in World War II. But let's be honest, the main draw to lots of authors is kind of the Battle of Britain, perhaps the Dam Busters raid, those kind of things. What was it about the Desert Air Force? I know you've written other books that you think is perhaps misunderstood, or is it not written about enough? Why choose the Desert Air Force?
Yeah, good question. Actually, it really comes back to why I got into writing at all. When I joined my first squadron, 39 Squadron, at that time a Canberra Squadron at Whitton, I had a degree in archaeology. So the boss said, you're the closest thing to a historian, you can take over the role of being the squadron historian. And I'd not really bothered too much about RAF history. I really more about Romans and barbarians. But then I was asked to organize a reunion. And at that stage, in the late 70s, we had guys coming back from World War I. And the interwar period, Northwest Frontier for us on 39, fantastic, interesting period as well. A whole Northwest Frontier province will be a good subject for you at some stage. And then into World War II. And in World War II, 39 Squadron was involved in the Mediterranean Desert Campaign as a Beaufort torpedo squadron. And so I got talking to quite a few of the surviving Beaufort and Beaufighter guys about their experiences in that campaign. So I've always had interest in that logistics side, supply side, which we'll talk about during this thing tonight as well, at the interdiction of that supply chain for Rommel. So that's really why I got involved in Mediterranean in the first place. And then about 4 years ago, I started looking at the Commonwealth and Dominion Air Forces. And of course, when you start looking at this campaign, the South African Air Force is critical to the success of the Desert Air Force. So I then started working with a guy in South Africa who's done a fantastic job of collecting archives of SAAF units and SAAF individuals. And we said, you know what, why don't we then look at doing something on Desert Air Force? And actually, this book here you're seeing here is the first of 3. 2 are out, which is this one plus then. I think on the next screen it shows you at the bottom there you can see, if you look when the screen comes on, Malta Strikes Back. That's the second volume, although the thrust of that is around Malta as an operational base, and we'll touch on that tonight as well. It also then continues to look at the anti-shipping campaign from North Africa as well. And then the third book, which sadly has not come out, is the one that takes you then through from El Alamein through to Rome. And the publisher didn't really want to take a look at that one, so I'll probably bring that out independently in a year or so. It's written; it just needs now a publisher.
And I'm glad you mentioned the key word logistics, because I think if there's going to be a recurring theme in these 4 shows this week, it is about logistics. And I did a school talk via Zoom this afternoon, and the question came up was Rommel the best commander of World War II? And it's like, no, because he didn't understand logistics, in a very simplistic answer there. But, to master the North African campaign or the Mediterranean, it is all about logistics, and aircraft types, of course, come into it and how you use them and tactics. But if you don't master the supply issue of being in the distances and spaces we have in North Africa, then, you're not going to get very far. So as usual, my guest has come armed with a presentation, and we'll kind of hand over to Kelly in a second. And folks, if you have questions, then fire away and we'll ask them as we go along. And I will do my normal interrupting if I feel it's appropriate. But there we go. So Desert Air Force, and an underappreciated aspect, I think, of the North African campaign. And the North African campaign is an underappreciated, I think, aspect of World War II. So over to you, Ken.
Okay, thanks very much. So the idea here, we'll walk through a few slides and conversation. Yeah, it is indeed. Yes, indeed. We'll walk through a few slides and some general topics. It's not a detailed history of the Desert Air Force or the air campaign 1940 to 42. It's picking individual bits and pieces that I think have worth discussing, really. And we can always then dive down into other subjects or more detail as you guys see fit. So basically, I've got a video here we can show at some point if we want to see it. But basically, this is the theatre operations we're going to talk about. The whole campaign, of course, stretches right from the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, just to the right of Cyprus there, right the way to Gibraltar, and of course then up into to Greece and the rest of it. But the focus for us is this central and eastern Mediterranean part of it. And Malta, you can see, is just here. So, I can't do that well. It's on this one instead. I've got two computers. So Malta is just here, and Malta is therefore very strategically placed to have an impact on the campaign generally. When you look down below that North African coast, you can see two things. Firstly, just how long a coastline you're talking about. We're talking in the 1,000-mile, idea here. So hence the idea that logistics will become critically important. If you look at those arrows that go, those lines go back and forward, you can see that on the bit that goes from El Agila, which is here, just to the left of Benghazi, west of Benghazi, off towards Egypt, there are lots of lines. That basically shows you where the major, I go west, then I lose out and I go back east again, and so on. That happens 4 major times, is what those 4 things are showing you there. You look to the left of that, from El Agila to the west, of course, there's really only then the continual Allied advance post El Alamein going right the way through to Tunisia, and then the rest of that North African campaign. But the other bit of desert between El Agila and particularly Benghazi and El Alamein sort of area is continually being fought over by the forces they go through. And that's the bit we're going to focus on today. But here you can see as well, I say, if you look at the supply route from Italy at the top of our picture here, right down to Benghazi and other ports along here, and Tripoli as well. This is the main route down for supplies. And we'll talk more later about that. You can see where Malta sits as a potential for interdicting any kind of naval supply route coming to North Africa. So that becomes one of the critical factors of the war, as does the fact that Malta survives. And not just survives, but as I said in the other cover of that book, Malta strikes back. You're not surviving. There's no point just surviving. You've got to be able to do something with that survival. And the ability to actually take part in an offensive is what becomes important for Malta's role in the war. So if we then look at this is the closer look at the theatre of war we're going to look at here now. Ignore the dates on that and things. We're just showing you, again, some of the main areas we're going to talk about. And the main ports we're talking about are Tripoli. And when we talk about bombing campaign, Tripoli becomes important. Benghazi, up here, and then over here you've got a port in Tobruk and Bardia, and these are mainly airfield sites down here. But the main ports are going to be Benghazi and Tripoli. So you can see now, if you can only bring supplies into Tripoli, that's a long way to go to get to a front line that's a few hundred miles off to the east. If you've got Benghazi, not such a problem. So the fight for the ports, and then as we'll learn later, the fight for the airfields is a critical part of what we have around here. If you're reading that text on the bottom as we're talking here, you can see here just what an extensive area the Middle East Command initially had, and we're not dealing with any of that. So we're not going to look at the East Africa campaign. We're not going to look at the campaigns in Syria or Iraq or even in Crete. And we'll mention very briefly Greece and Crete, but we're not going to look at those Eastern Mediterranean elements either. We're going to go pretty much from the working against the Italians in 1940 up to sitting on your arse in El Alamein, waiting for Cairo to fall. That's the kind of period we're going to cover. But understanding that geographic size of this is super important to understanding the campaign in general. The other thing to understand as well, and Paul kind of alluded to it, is that forgotten kind of war. It was also forgotten in terms of military capability. Even though you had that massive area that he had under his control, it was like about 120 airplanes for the whole massive geographic region. And we're talking airplanes like the Gloucester Gladiator and the Vickers Wellesley down here. So we're not talking the top flight of airplanes that are around at the time for the Air Force. We're talking things that really are, well, we've got these and you can't have anything better than this, so shut up and get on with it. Now, so that's very much the way that when you look at 1939, 1940, even into the early part of 41, this is where you're really dealing with this. And the Gladiator is the main fighter type we have within this theatre at the start of the...
And just to jump in for a second, Ken, because we had Battle of Britain Week a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about the importance of the Dowding system in Britain and all that investment, if you like, in protecting Great Britain. And of course, one of the things we've talked about quite often on World War II TV is if you're putting resources into one area in this early part of a war, it means you can't be putting them somewhere else. And so the price we're paying for how successfully we set up the defense of Great Britain is the fact we haven't got this massive, great technological boost of aircraft and numbers in North Africa. And that's, I think, one of those things about the early part of the war for the British particularly, is wherever we put our strength, it means we're leaving somewhere else lacking in strength, whether it's convoys in the seas or air force.
And of course, up until June 1940, Italy wasn't in the war, and therefore, in theory, there was no direct, immediate threat to the Middle East. Now, Churchill, as we'll see, was very much dedicated to a Mediterranean strategy for both good and bad, as it turns out in the end. But that's what he sought as a critical part to the empire. And of course, the Suez Canal leading through to the Far East Empire as well. But getting airplanes out to this area, again, becomes quite a difficult task. And we'll talk a bit later about this route through West Africa, about getting airplanes through West Africa out to the Middle East. And it's why you see a lot more American types being used by the British out in the Middle East, because they're available. So you don't find P-40s flogging around Northwest Europe in RAF roundels, but you find lots of them flogging around the Desert War. So we'll talk a bit about that as we go through as well. But so it is very much a backwater that initially is not seen to be a major problem. And if you thought it was a problem, what are you going to do? If you sent another bunch of Hurricane or Spitfire pilots out from the UK in early 1940, what would happen in the Battle of Britain? Would that have then been a problem? You find later on that the Middle East starts getting reasonably good supplies, but the Far East is then starved. And they're flying through the Middle East, but then on the way to the Far East, that were then nicked by the people in the Middle East. They get as far as Malta and someone say, I'll have that one. They get as far as, the airfields around Cairo, and they say, we'll have those. So the number of airplanes that actually made it through the Middle East out to the Far East was not high at times, because, my need is greater than yours and possession is 9/10 of the law. So I've got it and you're not having it. But you're right in terms of what we can provide out there. Fortunately, of course, the Italians, likewise, in terms of fighters, it was a CR-42. So you've got biplane versus biplane, very similar performance, very similar armament, and so on. So you weren't going up initially against 109s and things. So we look at a few key events down here. If we look at then 1940, then obviously it all really kicks off in June with the Italian declaration of war, and then 2 days later with the RAF bombing Tobruk Harbour. So bombing for us to start with here, we have Blenheims and Wellingtons are the two main bomber types we see within the British forces at this time with any kind of range. And then of course in June we start the advance. So we're now deciding that the Italians are fairly easy. Big superiority in numbers of the Italians over the British in terms of ground forces and in terms of air forces. But the British adopted a very aggressive stance early on, to the extent that, we don't think this is really going to be a major problem. So the advance into Libya, but that doesn't last long. So that is then turned around, and the Italians start pushing across and end up at Sidi Barrani. And Sidi Barrani is basically over this area here. You can see Sidi Barrani. They were inside the Wire of Egypt. So the Italians actually do manage to make an advance. People often turn around and say the Italians never did anything, they're all useless. This is actually not fair, really, on the Italians. They had totally crummy command and control and totally crummy commanders in many respects. We'll talk a bit more later about command and control as well. But that's the high point for the Italians, really, which is often just ignored completely, that they did actually make some advances through, because the British at that stage were very weak in terms of their numbers. So Graziani, who was okay as a commander with what he had, it managed to get across the wire in Egypt. You can see there again on the left-hand side, you can see the October invasion of Greece by the Italians. Initially not a problem, except that the Greeks then press the button and say, hey, Mr. Churchill, you promised us help. Please send us some help, or else we're going to be in trouble. And the RAF then send a small number of aircraft into Greece in November, but enough to actually start having an impact on that campaign against the Italians. But we're not really going to cover much about that area. What's really important to us now is that first out-of-offensive there in December 1940 called Operation Compass. And if you again look at that first few months in 1941, you can see how quickly that advance goes. So Bardia, one of those important areas down here, is captured. So we're now on the border of Egypt now on the 5th of January. So we've thrown the Italians out of Egypt. And then another key date in there is on 10th of January, the Italians start blitzing Malta, but we'll come back to that a bit later on. Now, 22nd of January, we've captured Tobruk. So we're now up to as far as here. So this is Tobruk here. So we're starting to do fairly well with our advance. And of course, when you start tumbling an enemy force back on the ground, especially if you've got a certain amount of air control at this stage, although it's not called the Desert Air Force yet, the Desert Air Force does have an element of air control around here. They're more aggressive and they're more able to support the land forces in the advance they're actually making. 6th of February, it keeps going further on, and Benghazi now, right over here, we've now taken Benghazi. So the Italians have now lost their major port on this eastern part of the campaign theatre as well. But you can see there are 3 dates, all the 6th of February. One is good news and 2 are bad news. So there's the first of the bad news is Churchill says, you know what, stop the offensive. We need to send more people to Greece to turn the tide on the Greek campaign. And then on the same day, Rommel is appointed to Africa Command. So both those things, although Rommel is not yet going to have a major impact on that for a few weeks, but the halting of the offensive has been one of those strategic decision points where many people have said, if you continued the offensive in North Africa, could you have thrown the Italians out completely and won the North African War before the Germans could intervene? So one of those strategic key turning points of the war. And that was very much a political decision. That Churchill was the one that very much said, I don't care, you're not going to go any further because I want all those airplanes and all those blokes to go across the water to go and help out in Greece. It's like all these strategic decision points. You pay your money, take your choice. Churchill played the political game that said, we promised the Greeks this. If we make promises we then fail to keep, what's the long-term prospects of us if we do that? So breaking promises in the old days occurred less frequently than it does nowadays, and therefore, what do you do about that? Now, there'll be people on this call who have different views and opinions. I read different things about that, but we're not going to go into that kind of process right now. What we're going to say here is we had a minor Italian advance, but then the first of the big push you back into the desert ideas comes from the Allies. We push them back to that line there by Benghazi. So essentially here, again, you can read the text, a couple of quotes from people who are bombing things. So the Blenheim was our major bomber, initially the Blenheim 1, then the Blenheim 4. And what we're doing, though, in this early part of the Desert War is very much developing a little bit of the tactics like the Germans used in Blitzkrieg. Not to the same extent and not with specialist airplanes in that, but the mindset is very much one about supporting the troops on the ground. The other advantage in the desert is whatever you bomb, you're not likely to damage anything else. You're going to damage a bit of desert or the target. So it's much easier to fight that kind of bomber war, really, in that area. Fighter-wise, say, we have the CR-42, like one crashed on the right-hand side being inspected by the good guys, and the Gladiator on the other side. And again, the Gladiator squadrons very quickly decide they've got a morale advantage over the Italians. They think the Italians are reluctant to engage and to fight. And whether that is true or not, that is the mindset the Allied fighter pilots had, and therefore that gives you an advantage going into the fight. If you believe the other guy is either not going to be aggressive or is going to cut and run, you've got that extra bit of adrenaline and bonus on your side. So morale is a very important aspect in any of these sort of air campaigns as well. So beating the Italians, very much a ground force war. It's all a ground force war, but the air element to it is obviously super, super important as well. So any first questions on that first?
No, I think I'm glad we are starting in 1940, because I think often when people look at the Desert Air Force, they start a bit later in the game, because I think it seems to be the narrative to start with the British doing badly and then have the British doing better towards the end. Whereas you started with the British doing better, then going worse, then getting better again. So you've added another kind of stage to the story. But I think that makes for a better understanding overall, I think.
Yeah, it is like a tennis match, knock, knock, knock.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why that first map is quite good. It shows you how many times that piece of land was actually fought over. But the arrival of Rommel, the arrival of German forces in the desert, the arrival top right there of some much more specialist and better airplanes flown by people who are quite good at this and had a bit of practice doing it. So the 109 and the Stuka become, without a shadow of a doubt, the major two German airplanes of the Desert Air Force War, and don't really change. I mean, there are other German types involved in it as well, but these are by far the most important in terms of the ground attack element with the Stuka, and obviously the fighter and some strafing as well with the 109. So when this comes in, then that's the whole idea of, yeah, we've beaten the Italians, it won't be a real problem here. You're now going to come up against people that are a little bit better at this than before.
And we may just mention at this point, Ken, that someone said on the sidebar a bit early on about how the British kept the Spitfires and Hurricanes in Britain too long after the Battle of Britain. And maybe that is worth mentioning now, because we now have the ME-109s and Stukas that have been kind of, I mean, not necessarily exactly the same aircraft, but certainly some of the same pilots. They've kind of, the Germans have definitely switched their attention, and the British are still maybe a bit reluctant to kind of to lose some of their aircraft from the defense of Great Britain.
A bit of that. I mean, Hurricanes start to bleed their way through quite quickly. We mentioned Gladiators before, and the Gladiator is certainly the first and most important of the airplanes, fighter airplanes in the first part of the war. But Hurricanes start to arrive in reasonable numbers fairly quickly. But they're the earlier versions of Hurricanes as well to start with. So when you start pitching those against the 109s, they're still not actually in a great position. Yeah. We'll look at fighters and bombers a little bit later on as well, more particularly. But yeah, you are very late in getting Spitfires. And like all the way through this, forget guys will start whining and saying, we've got Gladiators, we need Hurricanes, we've got Hurricanes, we need Spitfires, or we need Hurricanes with cannons instead of Hurricanes with Brownings. The standard, complaint scenario that fighter pilots had in the UK transfers to the Middle East as well, in terms of, if you give us a kit, we'll do the job. If you keep giving us the old kit, then we can hit this airplane with our guns, but it doesn't go down. So give us an airplane with better guns. All those same debates and arguments continue through into the Middle East. And of course, you've got guys coming as experienced fighter pilots from the UK scenario and the European scenario, Northwest Europe scenario, who know that. And therefore know the challenges and the issues. The big thing you'll see here, though, they get the P40, and the difference in the P40 we see is it's got the gun that many people wanted in the Hurricane. It's got the half-inch gun instead of the 303, and so that then guys who've flown Hurricanes go, well, I quite like the punch in this thing, but I'm not totally convinced by the performance of the thing. And we'll look at that in a minute. So basically in March now, we've sat for a few weeks after the decision by Churchill to halt the offensive, but now Rommel's going to go onto the offensive. He's not got a great deal of build-up of German strength yet, but Rommel all the way through his offensives very much just took the offensive early. He was a gambler. He was lucky a lot of the time as well. I agree with the comment you made earlier when you and I were talking, Paul, about Rommel not being the greatest general around. But as Napoleon would have said, a great general needs a lot of luck, and Rommel certainly had a lot of luck, and he had the balls to make decisions that most of the Western generals, certainly in the desert, didn't want to make. He would not make the brave. He made the brave decisions others wouldn't do. But as you know, at times he put himself into the battlefield area totally out of command and control of the Africa Corps. So he was very lucky that the Germans had quite a good depth of command and control and didn't rely on a single figurehead to say, when was time to get up and when was time to go to war. So you can see here then from the launch of 30th of April, it's a very quick run back again, often known as a Gazala gallop on the run back towards Egyptian frontier. So Benghazi falls. We get the attack on Greece by the Germans. That's not going to make a difference in the campaign there, which is why Churchill made that decision to change. But even by April, then less than a month, they've gone all the way back and they're now entering Egypt. So we're back to where we were with the initial Italian offensive before we did our own offensive going that way. And then just again for context there, May we evacuate Greece and Crete, but an important one there, and the reason I mentioned that Tedder becomes Air Officer Commanding in Chief in the Middle East is Tedder is one of the great commanders of World War II, one of the great air commanders of World War II. And having Tedder in that senior role in the Middle East was one of the critical factors in the success of the Desert Air Force, without a shadow of a doubt. Partly because he had the support of Churchill, but he also would stand up to folks. He was also able to work very closely with the air and naval commanders in theater as well, which is very important. That tri-service collaboration is very, very important, particularly important in the Desert War.
You have no arguments for me on that one, Ken. I mean, Tedder has all those qualities that Eisenhower had of being able to get on with people and
Yeah.
had the ability to back it up. It's all very well being able to be good with people, but if you haven't
Yeah.
got the ability to back it up, it seems Tedder to me is a genuinely an unsung hero of World War II. I think.
Very, very, very much. I mean, he also had the ability to pick good commanders on him. So having
Yeah.
got Cunningham as the head of the Desert Air Force, he got the right guy there. But then he also then let him get on with it. So he wasn't one of these interfering commanders. He didn't have a long screwdriver to every decision that was being taken. So Tedder was, I think, is a great example of what a very senior air leader should be,
Yeah,
and a
no
strategic
argument from
thinker
me.
as well.
No, I agree. I agree completely.
I put this one slide in here to say that we're talking much about fighters and bombers as we go through, but recce has always been the key to everything. If you don't have intelligence, then you can make dumb decisions, but it's hard to make good decisions. And so this is a pair of Marylands flown by 39 Squadron. And again, one reason I got involved in this was because we did this very short period of being SR strategic recce with Marylands. So the Marylands provide very comprehensive photo coverage of the ports, the campaign areas generally, and without that very comprehensive photo coverage, it's much harder for land commanders to make good decisions. And recce is often one of those overlooked air power aspects. As a recce guy, I did 2 recce tours, PR9s for 5 years, and then Tornado recce in the latter part of my Air Force career. Yeah, I know that recce is the key to all things, and in wartime, the first thing the commanders ask for is more recce, more recce, more recce, more recce. In peacetime, they want more fighters, more fighters, more fighters, more fighters, because they're more fun. But the recce is actually what allows you to be good at what you then go and do. So just we went into Greece and Crete briefly. The only reason Greece and Crete is really important is because of that dragging away of people into resources into another campaign. Personally, I think it was probably the right decision to go and get involved in Greece because of the political aspect of that. It gives you good political capital. However, the rapid failure of that military intervention then kind of knocks that back a little bit and says, well, yes, it's all very well you said you come and support me, you did, but you failed miserably quite quickly. So, but I still think it's probably the right thing to do. And you can see there again how quickly it happened. So 6th of April, the Germans declare war on Greece. 21st of April, Greece says, please to all leave because the Germans are, bombing the shit out of us. And then by the end of May, or middle of May, the evacuation of Greece is complete. What's left, actually, not much evacuates. There aren't many aeroplanes left to actually evacuate. Troops, yes. So again, another Dunkirk spirit. We evacuate Greece quite efficiently. We go to Malta, to Crete, which turns out to be another grade A disaster. Crete really should have been able to have been held. Churchill was very upset in capital letters about how rapidly Crete fell. He saw Crete as being an amazing bastion with its quite good ports, a number of very good airfields, and really should have done a better job of holding on to Crete. And again, it's really a whole session to go and look at something like the Greece-Crete campaign, or even the reasons why it fell so quickly. The illustration at the top right-hand side is really to show that much of this is about people and individuals as well. It's not just about bits of kit and strategy. So that guy there on the left-hand side, Pat Pattle, probably one of the early great fighter guys. Basically anything between 45 and 60 scores from Pattle. A lot of Italians, a few Germans, and then again in typical fashion of the time, carried on flying when he was sick. He was told he shouldn't fly that day. He carried on flying and then was shot down and killed. But he was one of the only pilots left, in one of the only airplanes left. So he just carried on pressing on and doing what he needed to go and do. And again, you can see down the bottom right-hand side how quickly Crete then falls as well. One interesting thing with the fall of Crete is the way that the Navy did a fantastic job of bringing people away from Crete and back to Egypt, important forces to restore some of the military balance back in the Western Desert, but also suffered very heavily from dive bombing attacks on the ships. They lost a lot of ships, both destroyers and cruisers, in that evacuation, but held to it. So there were air power lessons there in terms of anti-shipping operations and the defense of ships as well. So we could jump off the campaign a bit, just a couple of general points around what was it like to be there. So basically, when you read the bottom there, it talks one of the quotes about the desert wind, but that's a typical sandstorm on the left-hand side, quite a small one. Quite often it will actually be wall to wall, and you wouldn't see anything at all. And you see the guys on the right-hand side trying to walk through the sandstorm. The tents would blow away. Everything you had, whether it's your aeroplane, your airplane engine, your guns, your food, your boots, your eyes, your mouth, all full of sand. And when it wasn't full of sand, they were full of flies. It says down there, clouds of vicious flies that descend on any exposed food, making an already unpalatable diet even worse. So whilst our lovely fighter boys back in the UK could land at Kenley and get on the pub and have steak and chips and a pint, it's not quite what was happening in the Western Desert. So the living conditions under which pilots operated and ground crew had to then maintain aircraft were quite horrendous. So again, there's some living conditions there. You can see that's the officer's mess at landing ground 130 on the top left-hand side. You can see the airplanes parked in the background, the tents with a slit trench on the right-hand side, and then the bottom left as well. And then it does rain in the desert. So on the right-hand side, bottom right, is a typical picture of a flooded piece of muddy desert. That's actually, again, a guy called Stan Gooch, who is a 39 Squadron Beaufort pilot, admiring what used to be his tent and his personal belongings. So the fact that you're able to then still fly 2, 3, 4 times a day if you're a fighter guy, and these are the conditions you're living with dreadful food, dreadful conditions. My respect for anyone that served in World War II is huge, and my respect for those, particularly in the desert and in the jungle, is beyond huge because of the conditions they were having to live in as well. The European ones, yep, my respect for Bomber Command is massive. But you lived in a nice mess most of the time, and you had some of the other bits and pieces going for you. Here in these theaters, it was not like that.
Yeah, good point.
Yep, pets. I love looking at pets. I mean, this became kind of a hobby of mine of collecting photographs of pets here. So you can see the top right-hand side, they had a dog and a cat. The South Africans were particularly keen on picking up pets. So Ops A and Ops B were the names of the dog and the cat on that squadron. On the left-hand side, Sani was number 1 Squadron South African Air Force, and Sani was bought, taken back to the squadron, and Sani then would know when the squadron had gone off on ops. When they were coming back, Sani would know before anybody else did. So Sani would run from wherever she was to the dispersal point and wait for the aircraft to taxi back in from the mission. So Sani was quite good. The one in the middle at the bottom there, that one was called Prang. Quite an appropriate name for airplane.
It's just, as soon as I saw it, I thought, what a brilliant name for a dog on an airfield.
Yeah, because there were so many prangs. I mean, the other thing with the desert airfields was it was so easy to dig a wheel into some sand and stick this thing on its nose. And we're talking a bit again about repair and salvage units, a thing that was really massively important to the ability Desert Air Force to maintain any kind of level of airplanes at all. And then occasionally you get things other than cats and dogs. Down the left-hand side there is Buzz, which was the 3 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force monkey. I think actually the monkey is the one sitting at the front, and the pilot's the one on his shoulder, but that's because I'm a navigator and I have to.
Oh, so that's a navigator joke there, isn't it?
Yeah. It's got a navigator versus pilot joke. So there's just a couple of bits there about some of the what it was like to be there. It's not just about dates and campaigns and miles operated. These are real people doing these things at the time. So Rommel now has run out of steam, and he's run out of steam primarily because of supply chains. You've got to get material now from Benghazi still all the way across here. You can't use Tobruk because at this stage Tobruk is still holding out. So Tobruk port is not available. You've got to bring it all from Benghazi. So Benghazi becomes one of the mail run ports for the bombers of number 205 group to go and bomb on an almost nightly basis. Benghazi and Tripoli being the 2 main ports. But for every gallon of fuel you bring into here, you're using some of that to move it further forward. Yeah. And it's not just fuel, it's lorries, it's tanks, it's everything else. The other thing you'll find in the Western Desert is, unusually for equipment, the Brits have the best equipment when it comes to trucks. So whilst we didn't have great tanks, and you don't find many of our tanks being used, or you'll see a photograph in a minute of a Allied tank being used by the Germans, trucks became something that the Germans did use in large quantities. So if you're flying along in your P-40 or your Hurricane about to strafe a convoy, and it's a British truck, is it a British truck, or is it a German driving a British truck? So identifying equipment then becomes a bit of a challenge as well. That's where intelligence can help you. It says, well, there should be none of the bad guys in that area pointing that way. So fill your boots. However, some mistakes then get made. So recognition panels and things come into play as well. But that use of other people's equipment becomes quite important as well. So down the bottom right-hand side there is a Hurricane of number 1 Squadron, South African Air Force. And I mentioned earlier that the whole concept of the South African Air Force being critical to the Western Desert campaign. There are a large number of fighter squadrons flying P-40s and Hurricanes that are South African. There are whole wings of South African Air Force squadrons. There are South Africans flying with RAAF squadrons as well. Without the South African input to the Desert Air Force, the Desert Air Force would have been about 40% as capable as it was. So it's a massive importance for that. And that has also been ignored for many years, partly because in the post-1945 period, or certainly apartheid period, if you mention anything good about South Africa, you were seen to be, a nasty person. And so the whole role of South African Air Force in particular, as far as I'm concerned, in World War II, and especially in this campaign, has been underwritten, underappreciated because of politics.
Well, absolutely. I in my prep for this, I pulled out a big kind of A4 format book on the Desert Air Force that I had when I was a kid. So it's probably published in the 70s or the 80s. And I don't think there's a single mention over the sort of 200 odd pages of the South African Air Force at all. It's just, it's perpetuating the two types kind of myth. Everybody was Carruthers or Carstairs with handlebar moustaches, and they were English. That's the narrative that book was saying. And it's, as we now understand when we've had Robert Lyman on talking about the 14th Army in Burma, that the multicultural aspect of these forces is finally being understood, and about bloody time, frankly.
Well, if you look at the ground force, even more, of course. You look at New Zealand, Australian divisions were critical. South African, I mean, the ground force element that was British, apart from the armour, was relatively small.
Yeah.
It's much more around, the Dominion and Commonwealth ground forces. But air-wise, for me, it's the South Africans that make all the difference. There's the Australian squadron. There's 2 Australian fighter squadrons flying as well, 3 Squadron and 450. But there are other people out there as well that are doing things from the air side of it. So for 1941, then, we're on the offensive with Crusader, which looks like it's going very well. Tobruk is relieved on 10th of December, so we're now halfway across now here. So within 3 weeks, we got to that point. And then Benghazi over here, the important one, the port, falls on the 24th. And eventually we make it as far at the end of December, we get as far as there. So in other words, back where we were before. So this same bit of desert is being fought over time and time again. So it's very, very important. We'll look at airfields again in a minute, the importance of airfields to making all this happen as well. So Churchill is quite happy that things are all going quite well, but we stall on that offensive then at El Aguila. And of course, Rommel has now managed to get some more supplies back in. We'll come back to supplies again later on as well. And of course, rather than sitting and waiting, he's now going to continue as well. Because now we're stuck here at El Aguila. We've now got the supply problem. How are we going to get supplies up to ours? So whoever's gone a long way has that supply challenge. Now, you can try to capture the supply depots of the enemy, and the Germans actually got quite good at capturing some of the Allied supply networks, but you can't really rely on that. So logistics is super important. An airplane can't fly without fuel, without oil, and there's no point without bullets or without bombs. So unless you can get all those things to where they need to be, and you can't air transport those things satisfactorily. The Germans do it a number of times with Ju-52s, and critical spares are occasionally flown by the Air Force, even in old airplanes like Bombays and things, to critical areas. But for the mass of what you need, certainly for land force operations, it's got to come by road to you. And in terms of the getting it across, it's got to come by sea across to Tripoli or Benghazi. And for us on the Allied side, then it's going to come up through the Suez Canal into Egypt and then be sent to the front line. But you're still having to move it from your logistics base forward to your operations area. And there's many occasions I read when German panzers run out of fuel, and then eventually a convoy of trucks will find them, and then they'll refuel and off they'll go again. So it's a very hit and miss sort of event. So the thing on the bottom right-hand side there is just mentioning the fact that now the 109s are here, the Desert Air Force has lost its air superiority. And you get people like Marseille, who is called the Star of Africa, with his massive number of kills. Not an Eastern Front kill machine, this guy, but actually killing lots of things in the Western Desert. And this is where you're starting to see the P-40 is now really being outmaneuvered and outgunned, and to extent they're being out tacticked as well in the Desert Air Force at this stage. So we've on the back foot really in terms of air power as well. By this stage, we're starting to get the first Spitfires being introduced into the area, but the Spitfire was never a critical aeroplane as far as the Desert Air Force is concerned in the period that we're talking about now.
Yeah.
It was very much a P-40 and Hurricane war, and the majority of that was spent in attacking targets on the ground. There's a great line as well when they do this offensive. You see this thing here, Bir Hakeim, which is held by the French in these boxes, and there's a great little exchange signal. It's in, I think it's 112 Squadron's diary, which is a signal from the French commander saying, thank you for all your help to the squadron, and the squadron sends back as they were saying, thank you for the sport. So there's that little exchange of things going on. So that support of ground forces is important. You can't get a land force support there very quickly, but you're now starting to develop here this air power support that's able to get to that location relatively quickly and with some effect as well.
Would it be fair to say, even at this point when the Germans probably do have the upper hand, is that the British, the Allies, the Commonwealth are getting the cooperation between the services, getting it sorted better? It's not quite at its peak yet, but they're addressing problems, and they're moving towards a more streamlined system. Is it fair to say that
they are?
The clue is it's not there yet, but there's signs that it's going to get better.
And Crusader is what really brings that into play. So here, this guy called Andrew Geddes, who's quite a well-known Army Corporation pilot. He was a 2-squadron guy at one point, and he was seconded out to here and attached to one of the corps. And he wrote a report, which we've got a copy of, which was his report on Crusader and the build-up. And so he gives quite a lot of detail there on the air-land cooperation that was being developed by the Desert Air Force, very much under the auspices of Tedder and Cunningham, to develop that actual air-land concept. So they had a thing like the air tentacle. So you had the ability for a contact car to then call up a support from the Desert Air Force, stuff that became second nature in Northwest Europe after D-Day, but that was very much developed over here in the Western Desert and came very much into play again in Torch and the North African campaign as well. But they're developing on.
To interrupt you, that is absolutely the point that Mike Bechtold and Alexander Black, the two Canadian historians, make, is that the successes the Allies were able to bring to the ETO with the 9th Air Force, Second Tactical Air Force, was all born out of lessons in the Western Desert. It was all, and Tedder is part of that, of course, again, isn't he?
Yeah, and that's one reason why Tedder gets put into that role alongside Eisenhower again, because they were a team in the Western side for Torch, and they became the team back in Northwest Europe as well. So all those things they did up there were super important. But you've got to persuade the average fighter pilot that he's got to go and attack that target on the ground. The average fighter pilot wants to go and gun something in the air. He doesn't want to go and strafe things on the ground. A lot of the operational record books of the squadrons don't talk about the fact they don't like doing this, and losses become quite high. One thing the Germans were very good at was anti-aircraft defense. The British never quite so much. We never really got our act together on the anti-aircraft side. The Germans was always superb. And so there were very heavy losses to the guys when they went and did these fighter bomber or fighter ground attack type sorties, which they didn't like. We'll show a couple of pictures in a minute of strafe type things as well. But as you said about the fact that it's a long distance, it's a war of airfields. So one part we put into the book quite a lot was, without the airfields, you can't do much. Top left is simply showing you part of that idea of, you get a lot of broken propeller blades in the Western Desert, because the airfields are like that bottom right hand side. It's a bit of desert.
Yeah.
You park a few tents on it. There are no runways. There's no facilities. The top right-hand side is actually a Stuka landing at LG 86, landing ground 86, and that Stuka is being flown by 39 Squadron. 11 Italian Stukas landed behind Allied lines out of petrol, and so they basically then gave them around to various squadrons, including 39. And down the bottom left-hand side there is Axis wrecks on the airfield at Derna. So again, if you capture the airfield, then you have the ability to use things that are there, whether it's supplies that are left behind. It might be some of your own airplanes that are still there. You can then go and actually rifle bits off those airplanes. So building airfields and rapidly building airfields is very, very important as well. For the bombers, of course, are operating from the more established airfields back in the canal zone and places with proper hardened runways. But the majority of it is flown from these little desert strips, which really literally are cleared of a few bits of scrub, and off you go. It's like that. And there were hundreds of these, which is why many of them are just given a landing ground number. Some have a number and a name. The majority are just given a number. And again, it always amazes me as a navigator how they actually found some of these bloody things, you know, especially if you've got a bit of a desert wind blowing with the dust coming up. It's often blue sky out there, but much of the desert is not very easy to find things in, because it's hazy from above. You might look up and it's blue sky where you're in a sun lounger. Actually, when you're flying over it, it's not that great at all to actually find somewhere. So their ability to find things. However, the other side of that course is, if you run out of fuel or you're damaged, there's normally somewhere to put it down safely. And either you can put it down safely and your mate lands alongside you and you climb in his airplane and piss off into the distance, having destroyed your own airplane, or you get hold of the squadron and say, send a truck out to pick up my Hurricane, please. And they'll come and pick up the Hurricane and take it back. So that repair and salvage bit becomes important as well. We mentioned commanders already. So here you see left and right here are the two main guys, Conyngham, who's the head of the Desert Air Force, and Tedder on the right-hand side, who's the AOC. And at the bottom line, you can see there as well, and this is where the Navy and the Army often would complain about it, is that as Tedder says, the AOC must retain complete control of air forces throughout the battle. The Army commander would say, well, I want my own airplanes so I can do with them what I want to do with them. The Navy guy would say, I want my airplane so I can do what I want to do with them. But the integrity of air power is what Tedder and Conyngham believed in wholeheartedly. And in the Desert Air Force, they proved the value of that. Equally well, the land commanders couldn't complain, because whenever they called on air support, they got it. The only time it became a problem was in Torch in North Africa, where the Americans didn't really understand how the system worked and therefore would complain quite quickly about the fact there weren't 400 airplanes arriving in 2 minutes. So, but when they developed this, it started to work remarkably well, especially, I say, with this contact car part of it. Logistics, say, very, very important. The airplane top left couldn't go anywhere without that petrol Bowser, filling it with petrol. The one on the right-hand side, unless you can repair that airplane, then you can't put that airplane back into use. And the repair and salvage units would drive off into the middle of the jungle, in the middle of the desert, picking up whatever they could find, either because they knew it was there, or they just went looking for stuff and they bring it back. And again, they would go on their own. So you get a little convoy of these recovery trucks would go off unescorted into the desert. Quite often they'd end up behind enemy lines because no one really knew where the line was. And they'd find a couple of Blenheims or a Hurricane or two, and they'd bring it back to Cairo, and it'd get fixed. So the turnaround of airplanes in Cairo, in particular in the stations around Cairo, was massive. So again, bottom right-hand side, that P-40 couldn't go anywhere unless it actually had the bullets to make sense of it. Bottom left-hand side is squadrons moving. So when you're moving from airfield to airfield, the pilots can go off in their airplanes. What happens to the ground crew? So again, they developed a number of bases where you could land at that base, and there'd be ground crew there already that would do immediate servicing for you until your own ground crew turned up, if they turned up at all. And occasionally, of course, the ground crew would get intercepted by enemy land forces and wouldn't make it at all. So the ability to keep this going.
Ken, as a 20-year RAF man, where you understand the importance of a base and all the people on that, is that when people have looked at the Desert Air Force, it's often just the top trumps comparison of aircraft against aircraft. It's the P-40s and Hurricane. And actually, like with all the theaters of operation, you've got to compare the whole picture. You've got to compare the speed of repair, the ability to move, the logistics, the fueling, and then you get a far more accurate idea of the two forces competing. Because the top trumps idea is easy, but it's that surface. This aircraft goes faster than this aircraft, we win. And of course, that's only a part of it, isn't it?
And then that's actually very, very, very rarely is that the case. It comes down to the tactics, the equipment on the airplane, the training of the people flying it, and the command and control of it. So, in the Air Force, we very rarely in our history, we had the best equipment, but we've had the best training. And so your ability to overcome the other guy's numerical superiority or supposed technical superiority is also very, very important as well. And part of that comes down to morale, the belief that I don't care what you're flying, I can still beat you. And so building that esprit de corps, that morale is super important. That bottom left-hand shot there of German or Axis wrecks at Derna, you don't find that many pictures of the airfields with lots of British wrecks stacked up, because we had a much better ability to recover and reuse bits of airplane than the Axis seemed to do. They never really had an RSU type organization like we had. So they were relying on new airplanes coming out all the time, and that is one of the failure points as well. So the other thing for logistics-wise is this thing here, the Takoradi route. In the early part of the Desert War, we were flying airplanes out direct, or, over France or around Portugal, then into Gibraltar, Malta, and hopping along that way. But eventually that became just too difficult, especially for the fighter types. So they're brought in by sea to West Africa here in crates or on carriers, and then they're flown across normally to here, sometimes here and going off to Asia, but normally to come into here for us. You can see here the number. So 1,500 airplanes came across in that first kind of year of the war. That's a lot of airplanes. Most of those are going to be fighter types. And for the American types, the P-40s, they'd arrive in crates. This is the crates here. They'd be erected and then test flown in Takoradi, and then flown along this route, normally with a multi-engine airplane as the escort, the navigation airplane, and the other guys just following along various stopping points to refuel along this massive route to get you up into there. But without that, then you wouldn't have got this number of airplanes into theater. So setting this sort of thing up as well and making this work was very, very, very important. Quite often a fighter squadron deploying from the UK would go around this route. They'd end up at Takoradi. They would then fly their airplanes or somebody else's airplanes into the Western Desert Theater and then be assigned to either a squadron or a role when they got there. So you can see how many airplanes are stacked up here at Takoradi as well. So super important, this whole idea of this reinforcement route through Africa. Again, often completely, ignored in terms of understanding that, as you said, it's not about whether a P-40 is better or worse than a 109. Is, have I got enough P-40s? Have I got enough people to fly them? Have I got enough fuel and bullets and bombs to operate the P-40? So logistics is super critical.
So essentially what you're saying is it's better to get 10 P-40s via West Africa than 2 Hurricanes via the conventional old route, is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, assuming you've got the people to man the things, it absolutely is. Because then both sides are going to suffer attrition. All wars are a matter of attrition. One of the reasons we bombed the bridges in Iraq in Gulf War I was to prevent supplies coming back to the battle area. So when they've used up their supplies in the battle area and no more are coming in, guess what? You're an easy target because you're not getting any fresh troops, fresh tanks, fresh water, fresh ammunition, fresh whatever. So interdiction becomes a part of shutting down the operational area. And so you need to ensure you can keep supplies going into that operational area. And for us, that was running the convoys through the Mediterranean at the risk of those well. The fast convoys with tanks, for example, going through to Alexandria was one major route. For airplanes, eventually the major route became this Takoradi route. So we talked about fighters. So there's our 3 main fighter types we see, ignoring the Gladiator. So P-40, the classic with the shark's mouth on the top, is a 112 squadron. And the reason they did that, one guy quite liked the idea. He thought the big air scoop at the front looked like a mouth, so he had somebody paint teeth on the airplane for him, and then eyes, and then the rest of the squadron, hey, it looks really cool, we'll do that. So they painted the entire squadron's set of airplanes with the shark mouth. Then they were copied by a few other people after that as well. So the P-40 was very much the workhorse of the Western Desert Air Force for the first part of the war, and then with the Hurricane coming in equal numbers and eventually starting to become the more dominant type later on as well. But the P-40 performed remarkably well. It was very resilient, very robust, strong airframe as well, took lots of hits, was able to deal out a good bit of punishment with this half-inch cannon as well. And of course, you could then strap a number of bombers under it and make it a fighter bomber. It didn't, however, necessarily have the performance of the 109s, especially any medium to high level performance. So low level, it was fine. And that's also the trouble with the Hurricane, but you're always going to be outsunned by the other guy if you had an airplane that could fly, go higher, and therefore drop on you from a great height. And eventually we got the Spitfire coming in on the right hand side, and of course then we're back to sort of normal game plan. But without the P-40 and the Hurricane, we'd have not had a successful Desert Air Force, and without the P-40 in particular. So probably the most successful of the American types to operate with the Air Force, really.
And is it fair to say that the P-40 outside of the Desert Air Force has a bit of a naff reputation, apart from the shark's teeth on the nose there? I mean, someone said earlier on the sidebar how it was deemed not suitable for the ETO early in the war, and yet managed to kind of not excel, as you say. Its performance was always an issue, but given what it was expected to do, I mean, it was a good aircraft overall, I would think.
It was, but it wasn't really. It wouldn't have been suitable for the ETO. I think that circus operations from Fighter Command in 1941 as an escort for Blenheims or other bombers, medium bombers over Northwest Europe, it would not have made a good escort for those bombers. It wouldn't have worked at all. If you then got later on in the war, when you're looking at some of the Mustang 3s doing ground attack, the P-40 could have done exactly the same role. So it would have been the wrong airplane at the wrong time in Northwest Europe, but it might have been useful later on.
But I think the implication is when people say something's bad for the ETO, ergo it's bad, full stop. And of course, that's not the point we're making. It's like saying the Fairey Swordfish couldn't have done, bombing of Germany, but for what it was doing from carriers, it was really good at what it did. It's understanding what an aircraft's role is, and is it performing that main role well? And if it is, what's the problem? But it's
yeah. And then, exactly right. And it is also a question of working with what you've got. I remember some years ago, there was some guy arguing in Canada about why did the British give the Canadians that crappy Halifax when they had the Lancaster? So they killed all these lovely Canadians by giving them the Halifax. And then somebody also saying, well, why did you let the Fairey Battle go to war? It was a useless airplane. Well, it's all we had at the time. So you can either turn around and say, I'm not ready to play yet because I've got the wrong airplanes, or you use what you've got and make the best of it. So the ability to whine loudly about something is something the military don't tend to do themselves, but other people do on their behalf, especially in later years. So you have to work with what you've got. If it's not the best you've got, you have to try to mitigate the issues with it to avoid casualties, whatever else, while still doing the job. So the P-40 filled that role nicely. We weren't producing the Hurricane to send, but P-40s were being produced in numbers that we could then take across to the Western Desert.
Perfect. Good.
So there's just a few examples of a ground attack. You can see that top left-hand side shows you just how low the guys will be flying. In fact, he's probably quite high, that guy there at the moment, for his strafe with his Hurricane cannon. On the right-hand side, that's the tail wheel of the Blenheim as they're going along the road, interdicting some transport. The guy on the bottom left-hand side is a guy called Tony Biden, and it was capturing Tony Biden with his 109 stare, that long-distance look that fighter pilots would adopt. So again, just put that in to show a bit of personality. And the bottom right-hand side is attacking one of the very few railway lines within North Africa. So again, much of the logistics movement, unlike in Europe, is by road because there aren't the railway lines. If you had the railway lines, they'd have been high-level, grade A targets, but you'd have moved a lot more equipment with a lot less fuel consumption if you'd had the railway infrastructure. The Germans in World War I and World War II relied on the European railway network to do any kind of cross front movement at all. But in the Western Desert, it was like that top right-hand side. It's a bit of road, or it's just driving the desert somewhere. There's only one road on the north. There's just the Bardia Highway. That's it. Via Balvea, that's it. Everything else is just drive where you want to do it. So ground attack becomes a thing that they really develop very heavily, and all fighters become fighter bombers. So they're really what we call in later years swing role. So I can either be operating as a fighter, or I can be operating as a fighter bomber. Once I've dropped my bombs, I'm a fighter bomber. I'm now a fighter again, but I'm also going to go and strafe things. So that becomes important. A couple of specialist airplanes, tank busting here. This is 7th Squadron South African Air Force with the 40mm cannon under the wings, and bottom right-hand side is the same thing again. And that's a British tank, a Honey, that's then been taken over by the Germans, and that's actually the South African pilot that knocked it out with his S-gun from his the two squadrons that were flying with that particular weapon. So again, very important that we're able to then take out armored vehicles with these as well. Although the major problem for the Germans with their armor was just running out of fuel. So logistics was the main thing. We talked about that already, this whole idea of ground attack with these tentacles. So here you've got your observers working with the forward forces that are liable then to, here's the Army Air Support Unit through to the air support section with an RF controller, and then calling on either aircraft that are already airborne or rapid response airplanes to come and do things where they need to. Exactly the same system we're using in Afghanistan. So when we get a troops in contact, that's exactly what happens. You've either got an aircraft scrambled, depending on the distance, or you've got one of the ones that's already on cap somewhere, going in and doing exactly what these guys were doing here. So that was completely developed by the Desert Air Force, and then taken on from there into all the other campaigns as well. Bomber-wise, Blenheim, Wellington, and then we start getting some of the American medium bombers being used by the Brits as well. So Baltimore's and things coming into play. So a lot of American types used by the Desert Air Force, which were not then used elsewhere in large numbers by the Air Force as well. So the bombing side becomes important. You can see there, he's bombing a bit of desert. Well, you know, for every bomb you drop, or every 100 bombs you drop, you might find one will go somewhere useful. So a very large expenditure of bombs in moving bits of sand around. And again, if you drop a bomb on the sand, the blast effect of that is quite low, which again we found in the Gulf War. Sand absorbs the impact of the weapon very, very quickly. So if you don't hit what you aim at, it's not likely to do it much damage. You might get some sand in his cup of tea, but that's about it. It's not going to do anything more than that. So that's a bomber side. Just a very few words then on the anti-shipping side. We mentioned here about the importance of interdicting. So here's Malta. And you can see here that we're able to then from Malta reach out quite extensively. Most of the convoys gather in these areas along here. So in the Gulf of Taranto and up here is where we're gathering the convoys. They'll either sail that way around. You see the white are the convoy routes. Initially, they'll sail that way around. Eventually, when they're getting heavy losses, they start taking the long way around through the Greek islands to try to avoid the reach of Malta. But in the Desert Air Force, we're flying also from the airfields in the Western Desert. So again, this battle of the airfields bit is not just important for your supporting your ground troops, it's also important for the radius of operation of your anti-shipping effort. And you have a number of anti-shipping aircraft. The Swordfish and the Albacore. The Swordfish was much better than the Albacore, but the Swordfish was remarkably successful operating from Malta in the anti-shipping role. Down here, these are actually a bunch of Beauforts. These are here are Beauforts on an exercise in Alexandria Harbour with the Royal Navy, but exactly the same thing you would see with anti-shipping with the Beauforts. Torpedo airplane, and when you read the guys' accounts, you'd read it say, we climbed to 60 feet to release a torpedo. So they're flying this airplane around at 10, 15 feet above the sea. And then when they need to drop their tin fish, they climb up to get the right dropping parameters for dropping the torpedo. Torpedo, devastating weapon. And some people like Pat Gibbs, who was the squadron commander of 39 Squadron, was a superlative torpedo leader, incredibly aggressive and super effective at sinking tankers. At one point, Rommel was getting absolutely no tankers in at all. And it's not the supply ships of the tanks in that's important, it's the oil tankers. Yeah. So strategic recce would always look and say, there is a tanker in that convoy. This is now a high priority convoy to go and beat the crap out of. And so his ability to get tankers in became very, very small. And at one stage, he was getting probably less than 10% of his required fuel. But to Rommel, if I got 10%, that's good enough. We'll start an offense on the grounds, and I might be able to then capture some allied, oil facilities on the way. Bottom right-hand side is not Mediterranean; it's actually North Sea, but it's a Blenheim. So that's a Blenheim with part of its wing shot off, showing you the danger of bombing shipping as well. So Blenheim squadrons from the UK rotated through Malta, suffered heavy losses in anti-shipping, but a huge effort placed in stopping Rommel's supplies. Submarines obviously playing a role in that as well. Surface ships, not so much, but submarines are mainly aircraft. Without that, there would have been no success in the Desert War. Without interdicting Rommel supplies, the Desert War would have been lost. I'll just tell a couple of quick stories on this, and then we'll bring it to a close to get any final questions and things. So this is a guy. He's not on this picture, but this is Squadron 80 Squadron in the Western Desert, called. Explain to me when he was flying a sortie on here of convoy patrol. So he was flying a Hurricane, 80 Squadron. Jerry Jarrell's the guy, and I co-wrote a book with him some years ago. He called it "Did You Survive the War?" And he called it that because when he went to a squadron reunion, an air commodore was there. He said, Gerald, I remember you. Did you survive the war? Well, of course you did. You're here, aren't you? So that's why Jerry called his book, Did You Survive the War? But Jerry told me this one story. He said we used to fly pairs of Hurricanes over the convoys. So these are coastal convoys going along the North African coast. And you get a pair of Hurricanes, and every hour or so they'd be relieved by another pair of Hurricanes, and they go back to base. So he was on an early patrol with his mate, and his mate got out the airplane, and he was wearing his pajamas. And Jerry said, hey, you're wearing your pajamas. And I can't be. He said, it's too early in the morning. I can't be bothered to do anything else. I'm going to fly as I am. So off they go. They go off to the convoy. They replace the 2 Hurricanes that are there. They stooge around for an hour and nothing happens. Their relief turns up. And so this guy says to Jerry, I'm going to go and buzz that destroyer. So they're flying at 10,000 feet, and Jerry sees this other guy go down, fly around the back of this destroyer, and it shoots him down. So Jerry sees this guy end up in the water. This destroyer does a big U-turn in the water at speed, yanks this guy out of the water, and pisses off to Malta with him. And so Jerry's flying around going, how am I going to explain that when I get back? How am I going to tell the boss? He then told me, he said, I can't remember what I actually said to the boss, but clearly we got away with it. He said, but about 10 years ago from now, he said, I was standing in my garden talking to my neighbor, and his neighbor says, my brother's staying with me at the moment. He was in the war as well. So basically have a chat with him. And so he said, this guy came across, and Jerry said, oh, hello. Yeah, I hear you in the war. Yeah, he said, I was a Navy guy. I was on destroyers in the Mediterranean. It's a funny story. He said, one day we were sailing along, and one of you stupid bastards buzzed us. We shot him down, picked him up. Bastard was wearing pajamas. And so Jerry said that kind of rounded that story nicely for him, that this pajama story that Jerry had got. So on that anecdote bit, and one of the things I like to do is collect these stories and anecdotes from people to show that there is campaigns, there are numbers of airplanes shot down, there's performance of airplanes, but it's about people. It's about the ground crew service in the airplanes, about the pilots, and it's about the stories, the anecdotes that go alongside these things as well. Now, we could go on for a lot longer about these things as well, but let's have a break there and see if there's any other questions or comments from folks.
Well, so far that was brilliant, and my takeaways are the importance of connecting the Desert Air Force to the operations within the Mediterranean. I think that's a key thing to get across. So a couple of questions. We'll start with the last one I got. So Wolf is asking, how important was Raymond Collishaw for the Desert Air Force?
Yeah, Collishaw is another of those air commanders that's important within the escapade, because we said before, you've got to have the right commanders and sub-commanders in the network to make it work for you. So from Tedder down to Cunningham to Collishaw, all important individuals within that. Even Longmore in the early part of the Desert War, important in providing priorities for how things should be done. But it's that kind of team, especially the Tedder Cunningham team, that becomes really, really important. It goes right down to squadron commander level, of course, as well, that you've got to have the right guys at the squadron commander level. But it's particularly important at the AOC, the Desert Air Force C&C level. Those are the ones that really matter. And the important thing, again, with those guys is that they allowed the people below them to get on with things. You don't see much politics in the Desert Air Force as you do with land forces, for example, where someone will replace somebody because they didn't either like what they were doing or they weren't part of my team. Like when Rommel comes in, when Montgomery comes in, he replaced a lot of people because they're not his team. Whereas the Desert Air Force, you seem to kind of grow the right people up through the ranks, and a squadron commander then may become a commander of one of the wings and so on. So you're maintaining that credibility as you go through. And there are other names you could mention within the Western Desert as well, but without a doubt, the top two are still Tedder and Cunningham.
Okay, well, got to do a couple more. So Scott Grimwood is one of our American viewers. Was there ever an issue in getting parts and supplies for the P-40? And you said the aircraft coming in crates sometimes. And what about that, again, or just the bits and pieces you would need to keep them in the air?
Yeah, no, they were very. That doesn't seem to be much of an issue with that, but a lot of it of course, is robbing airplanes. You're losing lots of airplanes, both in accidents, in damage, with guys going out to the RSU. So without any supply line of that, you would probably find most of what you wanted will come out of repairable airplanes. The one comment they do make in Takoradi about the difference between a Hurricane coming out to Takoradi and a P-40 is when you opened the P-40 box, everything was there, including the tools. So if you only ever got one airplane, you could still build it. If you've got a Hurricane coming in, you have to go and find your toolkit to put it together. So the concept, and same with Jeeps, I believe, as well. When a Jeep came in, everything was in it. You could argue it's wasteful. I don't suddenly need 400 P-40 toolkits, but it certainly meant it was very easy to stick the airplanes together and move them then up the chain forward. So not really any real record of significant problems with supplies for any of the airplanes. But I think much of that comes down to the network of repair and salvage. One of those, again, under really appreciated
there's a couple of
areas.
comments coming in saying that the Desert Air Force just seemed to run a tight professional service compared to some other formations of that part of the war. But a question from the Great Dominion there, who always comes up with great questions. Would Ken like to say anything about the importance of the sinking of the Axis tanker Proserpina by the DAF Beauforts?
Nothing in particular. I mean, it's just another of the tankers. It was a 39 Squadron kill. There are, as were, I would say, a good 30-40% of the tankers that came across were sunk by a 39 Squadron. It was, its great claim to fame during World War II was its ability to knock Rommel's tanker force out of action. Other people sank tankers, of course, as well. But no, not really any different to any of the other tankers that were taken out. There's the odd tanker that got through as well, but the majority, there was one, I can't remember which ship name was, that they were sailing close into the Greek shore because they thought they were safe from torpedo attack. But Pat Gibbs had worked out if they changed the fusing and the depth setting on the torpedo, they would just get enough water on that side to have a go at it. So they attacked the convoy from the land side, which was totally unexpected. So that was one of the great things with Pat Gibbs. He was a great air leader, a tactical leader in that respect. And to him, any tanker that got through was an insult. So he would, take everything he could to go get rid of them. But very, very heavy losses. When you talk to the survivors of 39 Squadron, then they suffered very heavy losses. Okay. It wasn't designed for that area. I mean, the chapter in the 39 Squadron history that I wrote is called Beaufort weather. On the grounds that in northwest Europe, if you were tapped by fighters, you go and find a bit of cloud to hide in. There was no cloud to hide in, and you were flying early on the Beaufort 1 with a fairly poor engine as well.
So we'll do two more questions, then we'll bring it today. So Pat in Northern Ireland says, why does Ken think they didn't continue to use large caliber cannons in ground attack with the Typhoon, etc.? Was it because of this vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire that you mentioned earlier?
No, anything. I mean, the rocket projectile in Typhoon was actually even worse because you had to maintain a much more stable dive. And Jerry Gerald, the guy I referenced just now, Jerry went on from this to fly Spitfires and then Typhoons. And he said the Typhoon was the most terrifying thing of all because you'd be going down in the formation dive for the rocket attack and you would just see the guy in front get shot down. And then the guy behind him gets shot down. You're the next person in line because you're diving straight down at the target. And so for the gunner on the ground, the resolving where you are is not difficult. So whether you're doing strafing or dive attack with rockets, the same problem is there. The danger, though, really, for early on with the P-40s was flying solo that small arms fire can get you as well. So the lower you fly, or if you go back more than once, the classic thing with any kind of ground attack is don't go back again. Having got through and gone away the other side, for Christ's sake, don't go back. Whereas some of these guys would go around and do 2 or 3 strafe runs, and it'd be the second or third that would get them.
Wow. Okay, well, we'll do this one here from Amnuk there. Rommel was only getting 10% of his supplies. How much were Allies getting? Now, of course, that would depend on which part of the campaign we're talking about. But I think if I'm following what you said correctly, the point is with our repair and systems and our logistics, we are getting more. Would you have any idea what the figure would be?
No, I've not really seen a figure on that. We tend to see the Axis figures more because they're easier, because it's easier to track it in terms of shipping tonnage that makes it across. Remember, when it gets to Benghazi or Tripoli, it's not safe. The bombers will be bombing the hell out of the ports and the warehouses as well. So even though it made it into port, it didn't mean it was actually going to be stuff you could use in the front line. True. The Allied supply routes were more extensive. You had more options. The fast route through the Mediterranean became unsupportable at one point, but you still had fast routes sending tanks through. So Churchill would say, well, I don't care, send, and we're not going to get the tanks back here. I want another 400 tanks out to the Middle East, send it in a fast convoy through. And remarkably, a number of those got through as well. And you'd often split the convoy between what's going to Malta and then what's going to go on to Alexandria for the desert campaign. So enough was getting through to make up the numbers. Even when you get massive tank losses after Rommel's first offensive, you're able to make up the numbers up quite quickly. Then when you look at Montgomery, of course, with the amount of superiority and supplies he wanted before he'd even get up in the morning. Not a great Montgomery fan. You can tell that they were able to get supplies through relatively easily. And so, tanks take up a lot of shipping space. But you can send them around the Cape and up through the canal. You can send them through the Mediterranean. Much more options than the Germans had. That short route across the Mediterranean, and why they really didn't push the issue of Malta. If Malta had gone, then it is likely that 80%, 90% of supplies would have got through, and Rommel would have succeeded. I mean, his last offensive in 42, Brits thought they'd lost. I wrote a book a little while ago called Disaster in the Desert, which is one of these alternate histories where Rommel actually wins.
I haven't read it yet.
Rommel actually wins. And that's primarily because he has the supplies. He can increase the number of tanks, ground forces, oil. And so instead of stopping just inside the border at El Alamein, he's able to then carry on rolling through. And of course, having rolled through Cairo, and at that time, they were burning papers in Cairo. The Arabs were putting pictures of Hitler up on the wall and taking pictures of the Queen and Churchill off the wall, which has always been something that any kind of conquered nation always does, is flip the dictator's picture around to the other guy.
Wow. Okay, well, I mean, I want to remind people, as usual, I encourage you to go out and get Ken's book, either this one or the other ones. Links are in the description below. But just a final thought from you. For the viewers who are watching this who aren't aviation buffs, there are some who are real heavy aviation buffs, but those who are more generalists, what would you want a single takeaway to be? What kind of one thing should people be aware of when we think about the Desert Air Force in North Africa?
Yeah, it's a good one. One takeaway. It's probably the interconnectivity of all aspects, from the logistics and supplies to command. And actually, if you like, really the tactics and the other bits come a bit further down from that. You have great tactics, but without logistics and command, then it all really isn't going to work anyway. So it's understanding it's not about the bits of kit; it's about all the bits that make the bits of kit make sense.
I think I would agree with that. I mean, I'm not the expert on this subject, but I think my impression of the Desert Air Force from the photos is the kind of the scruffy individuals and the harsh conditions and the everything being a bit kind of rough and ready. And yet actually what you're saying is that the system behind this sort of living on an airfield in the middle of a desert with sandstorms is actually masking quite an efficient system behind it that's giving the Desert Air Force a kind of not a bad impression, but a sort of not amateur. I don't know what the word I'm thinking of, but a kind of a
cavalier
together.
and of course that will hurt the morale, and the morale is very important. I mean, during the time when the 109 was dominant and people like Marseille were around, morale starts to suffer. If you're starting to see heavy losses, then morale will suffer as well, and you need a good system behind that to make sure that doesn't become a dominant factor. And so you're quickly able to come out of that on the other side, and then you're in the supremacy again, and off you go. You still got heavy losses, you're still losing your mates on a day-to-day basis, but you can see that it's going the right way, not the wrong way.
I think
so. That
someone just gave me the word. They said improvise is maybe the word I was looking for. I think that possibly is good. Yeah, it feels like it's improvised, but actually there's a good system behind it. Well, we'll leave it at there, Ken. I mean, I'm telling you right now, I will want you to come back on a future episode and talk about something else, because people have really enjoyed this. Viewing numbers have been really good, and so did you enjoy it, Ken?
Yeah, great. I love talking about this kind of stuff and trying to.
We can tell. I think we can tell your enthusiasm comes through. So I'll just remind people what we've got coming up next week, next tomorrow, and then I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So, folks, tomorrow evening we have Samuel Wallace coming on talking about Operation Torch. Then we've got another show next day. We're talking about, I forgot what we're talking about the next day. I've completely forgotten it. The Irish Brigade with Edmund O'Sullivan, and then Edmund O'Sullivan. And then the fourth day, we're talking about one of these Italian victories that Ken was talking about earlier, Bir El Gobi, with the Italian historian Giulio is coming on for that. So that's 4 good shows for you. So right now, it remains me to say thank you very much, Ken, for joining us. And what are you working on right now? What's the next? Well, you said it's that 3rd volume that you may have having to have to self-publish, but anything else on the horizon beyond that?
I've just finished 2-volume history of the Canberra, which is a complete update and rewrite of my original Canberra book. And I'm now doing one which will go through print on demand, which is on how to understand World War II flying logbooks. We get a lot of people come to the Marham Heritage Centre veterans or relatives of veterans asking us to help do research on their relatives. And so we're now producing a kind of quick guide to how do you understand and put context around what's in a logbook.
That is a really good subject, because as more and more archives become digitalized and the general public have more access to documentation, understanding what is meant. There's a Jonathan Garner, American historian, did a book about how to research your loved one's service records in the US, and I think that will be an area that we need to improve our skills in. It's all very well getting access to documentation. What is it actually telling us, and what can we learn from it? And that would be good.
Because nowadays, you say, access is much greater now, so people can do a lot of their own research now as well. But having pointers, because the military, the Air Force in particular, always writing acronyms and code words and everything else, and understanding a bit of that helps you get more value from what you're reading.
Yeah, and of course the archives, logbooks were not there for the benefit of historians 7 decades later. They're there to record the events for the immediate efficiency of the units. It wasn't there as a historical resource originally. It was simply record keeping, but now we are of course using them as a historical resource. So understanding how to get the best of them, well, that's another, we could do a whole show about that. Anyway, right now it's been brilliant talking to you, Ken, and I wish you luck with your next books, and we'll book an invitation to come back and talk about something else. So
sounds good. All right, thanks, Paul.
Brilliant. So thanks very much, everybody. This is Paul Dash for World War II TV. I will see you all again tomorrow night when we talk about Operation Torch. Thank you, everybody, for watching.